Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. We're so excited to see you all. Welcome to our event, Community Solutions to Racism, the third in our series on grappling with racism, bias, and discrimination in the South Bay. My name is Gloria Gutierrez, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Torrance area, which includes Torrance, Lomita, Carson, Harbor City, and Gardena. I encourage you strongly to consider joining our membership, as it is with the support of our members that events like these are possible on this and other topics of interest, which are integral to the mission of our 104-year-old organization, empowering voters and defending democracy. You can sign up in the foyer. The League is nonpartisan and has been since its founding, which means we don't support or oppose any party or candidate. We do, however, develop positions after careful study. We do encourage our members to be politically active, and while we seek to educate the public to help them become more informed voters, we also advocate for social change that aligns with the positions that we have developed with careful thought and consideration. That leads us to tonight's topic, Community Solutions to Racism. Growing up in Torrance, I never learned about our own entrenched racist roots in the South Bay. Even last week, for the first time, courtesy of someone here tonight, I found out that Torrance to Palos Verdes made national news in the 60s for redlining and the protests that ensued in response. Last February, we hosted the first in this series with Sidney Morrison, who's here tonight, who returns, who shared his experience being the first Black principal in Torrance. Then in April last year, for the second in this series, our speakers demonstrated how Black and Brown communities in the South Bay have increased exposures to toxic chemicals as its own form of environmental racism, which increases their risk for cancer, autoimmune disorders, and asthma, along with developmental disabilities, ADHD, and behavioral disorders. Those videos are up on the website or will be very soon. The history I was taught here in Torrance, even in the advanced classes, took care to avoid controversial topics that would lead me to question why the things were the way they were here. Like, why are there so few Black families who own houses here? A neighbor of mine was one of the real estate agents blacklisted for selling to a Black family. I'd never even heard of redlining until after college, discussed with a report co-authored by two of our speakers here tonight. For more recent examples, why our local public school system receives so much funding from the local refinery when other local communities do not, the fear among members of the Asian community of acts of violence against them in public from strangers, which motivated one of our speakers to act, and the vile anti-Black video made in middle school by South High students, which then resurfaced and was used to suppress or hurt Black students last year. Another topic by another speaker tonight. Part of why I'm proud to be a League member is sewn into our very fabric, the promotion of civil discourse. It is ultimately grievous for democracy in our communities for families to forego talking about politics. Whereas politics are universally acknowledged, racism has multiple layers of added prejudice. Some don't think it exists, at least not today. Some don't think it's systematic, or at least not here. Others feel like it isn't theirs to discuss because it hasn't happened or isn't happening to them. Or others feel like politics, it's too complex or ingrained to solve, and there's no point in discussing it. Pessimism has its place to guard against the barriers and setbacks that would diminish hope, but it is misplaced if its consequence is business as usual. Instead, racism is the burden we all bear, some covertly and some invisibly, and for us to chip away at it or uproot it altogether, we must create a space around us and within us to learn about it, to make the requisite mistakes and understanding that can only be remedied by hearing stories from others. As we share in this space, please give space to yourself and others for listening, for speaking, for the development of a shared understanding. I mean this to say that it can take some courage to participate in the discussion if you never have, or if you've been led to believe it's not yours to have, or verboten. And I hope that those who've been in this space for a long time would give grace and support to those new to this space. It isn't easy, but that makes it all the more important to begin, because mistakes we made, and with each one, we learn how to listen better and speak better. In our first event, we shared that the Torrance Police Department requested an independent review of the police department by the California's Attorney General to come review their policies and practices following allegations of a bias incident and the exchange of bigoted text messages among a number of Torrance PD officers. We might have a member here tonight from that department. They've been providing opportunities this last year for individuals with experiences to share their stories for inclusion as part of their review. Their work intends to capture a sense of the way things are and have been, and they will have a formal report once they finish their investigation. If you're interested, please let me know and I can share that. Oh, there she is. Raise your hand for everybody. If you'd like to ask them about their report or see if they're still taking interviews, Christina Riel in the back can help you with that. Right. And that's the topic of tonight's event. Such a report certainly includes an intent of sorts to provide remedy should concerns be identified. So we'll be talking about community solutions. Please welcome our moderator, Kusha Modomo, who will introduce the speakers.
Hello everyone, my name is Kusha Modomo and I'm the treasurer for the League of Women Voters. I've been with our Torrance chapter since the summer of 2023, and I'm also involved in several of our committees, including the one that set up tonight's event and our Natural Resources Committee. It's my great delight to introduce our speaker for the panel, the first one going, Mr. Sidney Morrison. A little bit about his background. After 37 years of work as a teacher and administrator, Mr. Sidney Morrison retired from the Torrance Unified School District, where he served as a high school history and English teacher, a middle school assistant principal, high school assistant principal, elementary school principal, high school principal, and middle school principal. In fact, Mr. Morrison was my principal at Howardwood Elementary School. And he retired when I was in the 4th grade back in 2008. He provided leadership lessons that last a lifetime, and I'm very grateful that we were able to rekindle our relationship when I was a student at UC Berkeley back in March of 2019, when I wrote an essay about him as one of my greatest role models. Mr. Morrison now works as a consultant and coach in a variety of school districts and offers training sessions in academies for the Association of California School Administrators. Following his time as a UCLA history student, Mr. Morrison was drafted into the Vietnam War, and where he was awarded a Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire in 1969. Mr. Morrison has recounted some of those experiences as a medic for me in vivid detail, including his heroic rush to treat wounded soldiers in a minefield. Mr. Morrison is married with 3 adult children and 4 grandchildren, and he is also a published novelist. His first book, A City of Desire, is a tale of scandal and media frenzy centered around the life and death of Helen Jewett, a 19th century sex worker who was murdered in New York City. His upcoming novel about Frederick Douglass, the 19th century statesman who escaped slavery and became a leading abolitionist in the United States, will be published in June of 2024. Without any further ado, Mr. Morrison.
Now that I'm about to begin a book tour, I might as well promote it now. This is it. It's about Frederick Douglass, who challenged systems of racism and injustice, and I admired that as a young teacher at South High School when I was a teacher of history, and I wrote my first version of this book. This is the 3rd iteration, and finally it's coming. A dream has come true. So I hope that...
Recording in progress.
I hope that when my book tour starts, and Barnes & Noble, by the way, has picked up the book, that I'll be able to send you to Barnes & Noble in Torrance, and that you will buy the book, and I'll have a book signing there. But in the meantime, thank you for coming this evening. This is an important theme that I want to talk about in the brief time that I have. So the very first thing I'd like you to do is I would like you to turn to your neighbor and introduce yourself by name and to tell them why you came tonight. Please do that a favor to me right now. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. And now will you show, welcome to the experience. And the experience is the experience of getting to know each other. Because only when we know each other, when we share our stories, and we are the stories we tell, we are the stories we remember, we are the stories we hear and repeat. The only way that we can go into the forest of difficult conversations about race and prejudice and bigotry and bias is when we know each other and we listen to each other. And so that is the first step in creating a community of storytelling and listening. And now I want you to tell another story. If you can do the next one. And by the way, I will point out that you perhaps already experienced, for some of you, a problem with bias. And that is you might have a bias about strangers or public spaces, and that may have impacted how you responded to my question. And so today, the essential question is, how do we interrupt bias? Because we all have them. We all have biases. And so how do we interrupt them so that we can work together to form a greater community? And one way is to share our stories. So the next question I'm going to ask you to do is what was your favorite toy as a child? What was your favorite toy as a child? And if you've not had a favorite toy, or you weren't able to have a toy because of your economic circumstances, talk about that. But what was your favorite toy? And I will tell you my story after you've shared yours for a few minutes. So please turn to each other. You can stay in the same group and talk about your favorite toy. All right. Thank you for sharing your story. I hope you've noticed that once we begin the process of sharing our stories, we reveal ourselves. And often I discovered that I have to ring a bell to get you to stop, because we often are not given opportunities in our busy lives to tell our stories. In schools, in businesses, and some people actually have a bias against storytelling because they have been raised to believe, keep your private life in here. You're not on the streets. You don't tell people how you feel and what you did. And so that generates a bias against public disclosure. But my feeling is that in order to break the cycle of bias and racism and bigotry, we have to be free to talk about each other. And we have to create a safe space in which that exists. And I truly believe that it's the responsibility of leaders to create such a space, create such a haven for the discussion of the difficult. So I refer to this question because I have a story. My story is that my favorite toy were my sister's dolls. And that horrified my father because he had a bias against boys playing with dolls. And my sister didn't care about dolls, had no interest. But I was a storyteller from the early years as a child, and I saw these dolls as characters in the plays that I had imagined and wanted to share. I even forced my siblings to be actors in the plays that I wrote. But dolls were my way of interacting with characters and in story. And when my father decided that that was unacceptable, and he got me toy soldiers and castles, and those were characters in my stories as well. But in the reaction to my love of dolls, he revealed his bias about boys. And we have biases about gender, we have biases about race, and most of our biases are implicit. What they mean is that they're unconscious, and they are revealed when suddenly triggered by an object, by an experience, by an event. And very rarely do we have explicit expressions of bias. And I'm going to talk briefly about explicit expressions of bias, because many times people think those are the things that are either bygone, or because they're so outrageous, most people won't support them. But sometimes things happen and you're taken by surprise, as it happened to me when I was a principal at North High here in Torrance, when during a football game I got a call from one of the campus security people who said, "Mr. Morrison, there's this man who wants to cross the field during the football game. You do not cross the field between sides during a high school football game. That is a no-no." But he apparently gave this woman a hard time. And it may be because of his biases against her, because she was a Hispanic woman, very short, but she wanted to have this person be informed about what the rule was. And so I crossed the field to the other side, and she said, "Sir, this is Mr. Morrison, our principal, and he'll explain to you why you can't cross the field." And he looked at me, looked me up and down, and said, "So, they're hiring coloreds in Torrance now for principal?" Literally, he said that. And I took a deep breath, and I said, "Yes, and this head Negro is telling you you're not crossing the field." I don't know what this man thought. Maybe he thought because I had said what he had said, I was just going to slink away and let him cross the field. But I didn't. And I was angry, but I was reserved, but he just kind of walked away. But when I think about that, that was not a transformative experience for him. I mean, I literally just tapped into my anger and let him have it. And it felt good, quite frankly. But we're not here to confront, because if you confront out of anger, and sometimes righteous anger, you don't transform. So what is your intention when you deal with these issues? And my contention is, if we want to connect, we have to respond in a way that allows people to tell their stories, and for us to listen to their stories. And that takes time. It takes a willingness to not marginalize people. One of the things that I urge all of us in the creation of this space is to be curious about our own reactions. To ask questions. What? 5? Okay, great. How to react in a way that facilitates communication, facilitates the ability to ask questions so that people will get closer together and be courageous. And is this hard? Yes. I encourage you in the pursuit of this, and I give full credit to some people who have been doing this work for a long time. There's researchers who have been looking into bias in hiring, for example. Do you know that there have been studies to show that when people get applications, that they look at the names and they sort out names according to what they think is ethnic sounding, and put aside those that are ethnic sounding and only stay with the names that sound essentially Anglo. And this has been consistently happening, and that shows another kind of bias. And I'm sure the hirers would not agree that those are the case. But remember, these are things about unconscious things that we need to do. So we have to address our conscious reactions when, for example, you're in driving and someone cuts you off and you immediately assume they must be Asian because Asians are bad drivers. Or it's happened to me where I walk down the street and a white woman would literally just grab her purse and cross the street. And I'm not saying that that person is evil, but that person is responding to a trigger that is unconscious, and we have to be aware of that. So before I go, because I'm reminded of what happened at one of my elementary schools, because they know I love to talk, and they literally create a signal for me, which was a stop sign, and there it is. So I've been reminded that one has to follow the rules, but I'm going to close with reminding you about kinds of biases that you need to be aware of. One, confirmation bias. When you literally are looking for things that will confirm already your pre-existing beliefs. So you stay away from certain networks because you don't want to be, your ideas don't want to be countered. And so that's confirmation bias. And you seek out proof of what you already believe. There's this affinity bias where you stay around people and groups that are like you. And we tend to all be tribal. But when you stay in that silo, you're basically experiencing what has been called affinity bias, where you only want to be around people that are similar to you. Then there's conformity bias, where teenagers experience this very much. They give in to the ideas of the group even though they disagree with those ideas, because they want to belong. And we all want to belong. So we are subject to conformity bias as well. Then there is correspondence bias, where you tend to form assumptions based on your about the situation, and you make deductions about a person's character. So, example, if a car is speeding down the street, you immediately assume that that person is being reckless, and because the situation seems dangerous to you, but you don't deduce that maybe that's a medical emergency and someone has to, to break the rules and speed down the road. So that is called correspondence bias. And the last one I want to talk about is egocentric bias, where everything that happens reflects how your feelings, and you expect everyone else's feelings and reactions to be the same. And what we have to do is just to operate an assumption that everyone deserves to tell their story, that everyone deserves to be recognized as worthy of inclusion, and that everyone has the right to tell their story, and that we're going to practice, because this is what I want to encourage, the practice, the habit of listening and telling our stories so that we get to know each other. And as a result of getting to know each other, we become a more solid community. I have more to tell you about what I think the South Bay can do, but I want to suggest that the essential first step is storytelling and listening, and not presuming that your story is the only story worth hearing, even if you have been subject to injustice. Because you need to be curious why people say, I don't see color. Or, because people, unless you are biologically colorblind, you do see color. So why do people say the things that they say, they react the way they do? And everything begins with a question. And if it begins with a question, there's a possibility of connection and a solution. Thank you. Not enough time, but hey, I'm a rule follower. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Morrison, for that opening speech. I enjoyed hearing Mr. Morrison's descriptions about the different forms of bias that we're all prone to experiencing, and about the power of storytelling. I remember one of my favorite books in high school was To Kill a Mockingbird, and one of the scenes that was most transformative for me is when the character Atticus Finch tells his daughter that to really understand someone and to understand racism, you have to be able to crawl into someone else's skin, which is, I think, what Mr. Morrison is hitting at when he talks about being curious about why people say and act the way they do. So for our second speaker, we have Esther, and she is Esther Lim, the author of the How to Report a Hate Crime booklet, and founder and executive director of her nonprofit, Through Peace, an organization that focuses on educating minority communities on their fundamental human rights. Her booklet is available in 13 languages, in print and digitally. She has been recognized by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the County of Los Angeles as recipient of the Yvonne B. Burke Courage Award and the Beacon of Light Community Advocacy Award. Esther has received nationwide media recognition for her advocacy in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Esther also serves as board chair of the first ever LA County District Attorney Asian American and Pacific Islander Advisory Board. Thank you very much, Esther, for joining us. We're looking forward to it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out here and taking your time this evening to just listen and hear. So a bit about my background. I am Korean American. I was born here in LA, and my parents are Korean born, but they moved here to America in the 80s. And my entire family moved here because my aunt granted everyone access. So she first lived in Santa Monica, and she faced a lot of racism in Santa Monica where she felt ousted. So she ousted herself from that environment and moved to a place called Monterey Park where it was more culturally diverse within the Asian community. So from there, she invited all her siblings to come, and that's where our entire family resided, and our uncles, aunts, cousins, we all grew up together. But what I couldn't figure out was, when I was growing up, I always asked myself, why are people so mean to us? People who don't look like us, very mean, very rude to my parents, and I didn't know why. I didn't know how to identify racism. I didn't know how to identify discrimination until later on in life. And once in high school, where I realized, the definition of discrimination, of what racism was when I began to put the pieces together and realize, for 5 years we were living in Oregon, and our family was discriminated against heavily, and we were the only Asian family in Beaverton. And I remember one day a group of girls, when I went into 6th grade, they were amongst themselves, and one of them said, don't hang out with that girl Esther because she's Japanese and her family bombed Pearl Harbor. And to that I was so shocked. I didn't know what to make of it. And for me, socially, I was like, I'm already an outcast. So that feeling of uncomfortableness, I totally understand as being a minority here in America especially. And to process that was a very hard thing to do. I didn't know what my identity was, because what I was, I didn't want to be. Because of differences. And for me, being different in that community was not a good thing. And as I got older, grappling with my own fears and of experiences of being discriminated, even up till a few years ago, where I was denied service at a restaurant in Northern California. And so with that, I was like, okay, I know my rights, the Unruh Act, let's bring it. So it was only when I realized what my rights were, was when I felt most empowered to activate and fight for my own justice. During COVID, the height of COVID 3 years ago, there was a lot of social media and experiences. It wasn't even mainstream media talking about it. It was my friends' friends, and their parents' experiences of dealing with racial attacks, and it got physical. And the main victims that I saw, the majority of them were Asian women, elderly Asian women. And my mom, she's a nurse, so she was, the primary emergency care person, whatever. So essential worker, and she still had to go out to work, throughout the week, and expose herself already to COVID positive patients in that kind of environment, and then as well as outside of the hospital where people might physically harm her. And that scared me deeply. I was not able to sleep at all during those few months. And I thought to myself, my goodness, my parents already went through so much discrimination, so much hardships that they couldn't even speak about. But we saw. And I was like, for them to go through and experience racism again very openly, very candidly, I cannot bear that thought. And in their old age, I was like, how are they going to recover from this trauma? And I thought to myself, okay, well, what are my rights? So I did my research. I looked up if, if someone were to spit at me, would that be criminal? And yes, it was assault. So as I did more research on my own on preventative measures and what to do and who to report to, that's where I decided to create this booklet called How to Report a Hate Crime, first in Korean, for my parents. And it was because studies have shown, and it's proven itself, that those who reported crimes against them that they couldn't control, they recovered from their trauma faster if they would make a report, because that was a bit of their lives that they could actually control. And because of knowing that, I decided just to publish this in Korean first and English translated, but give it to my parents so that they can protect themselves if I wasn't able to be there for them to protect them physically. And once this got out, I started getting requests for a lot of more translations, such as Simplified Chinese, Traditional Chinese, Japanese, Tagalog. And so now it has grown to now 18 languages, where it's not only for the Asian community, it's for all minority groups who cannot, where English is not their first language. So this is something that I did just on my own to protect my parents at first, and it grew into a bigger project and more of a grassroots effort that came into fruition just so naturally. And because of the number of booklet requests that I've received so far, I realized this wasn't my own issue. This wasn't my own family's issue. This was more of a broader aspect. And because of that, I'm now distributing physical booklets at 160,000. So across 6 states. And to me, this isn't also a nationwide issue. It's a global concern, and something needs to be done about it. So I hope this encourages everyone that, you matter. You matter, all of us matter, but it's only if we can come together as a society and just help each other out a little so that we are able to live civilly amongst each other. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Esther, and I really appreciate your emphasis on how racism is a very global stain in its ugliness and its hideousness. And I think what you share for us with the power of documentation and reaching people in a more accessible fashion, it lends itself to show that we can help combat this by making ourselves fighters in the struggle against racism, and by proving that we can overcome it one individual at a time. For our next speaker, we have a set of 2 panelists. We have Dr. Anthony Asadola Samad, who became the executive director of the Mervyn M. Dimely African American Political and Economic Institute on the campus of California State University, Dominguez Hills. An author, columnist, and scholar, Dr. Samad has written 6 books and numerous scholarly articles. He is one of the most widely featured columnists in the African American press today. Over the past 25 years, Dr. Samad has contributed over 1,100 articles to newspapers and websites nationwide. He's quite prolific in that regard. Dr. Samad is also the director, writer, and co-producer of What of the Day, a 2016 documentary about the contributions of the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, an organization in which Dr. Samad holds the fraternity's highest honor as a Distinguished Service Chapter member. And also with Dr. Samad, we have Dr. Donna Nicol. Dr. Nicol is the Associate Dean for Personnel and Curriculum in the College of Liberal Arts at California State University, Long Beach. She became the first woman of color to be granted tenure and promotion to Associate Professor back in 2014 at Cal State Fullerton. She is the recipient of the 2021 Faculty Excellence in Service Award at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Dr. Nicol earned early promotion to full professor in 2021, the department's first woman to achieve this academic rank. Her teaching and research focus on history and politics surrounding African American educational access, with a focus of philanthropic foundations, university trustee boards, and African American women as faculty, university administrators, and educational activists. Looking forward to hearing from both of you. Thank you very much.
Good evening. While Dr. Nicol hands out the companion piece, one of the things that wasn't said in our introduction was that we were 2 of the co-authors of a county-funded study on inequities in Los Angeles County. The first one deals with the state of Black Los Angeles County. There will be one that also deals with the state of Latinos in Los Angeles County, Asians in Los Angeles County, and whites. The reason why the African American piece was done first because COVID disproportionately impacted them. Lori, I guess, has been trying to reach us for a minute. When she first reached out to us, Dr. Nicol was at Dominguez Hills, and then she got an opportunity and now is at Long Beach. And so we've been going around the county talking about this report. The report is 111 pages. However, this companion piece basically consolidates it. You can see it online. I know you're trying to save the life of a tree. But one of the things that both of us have done, and she will take you through the report momentarily, is we have sought to try to tackle this tough subject of racial inequality. We were co-chairs of a committee that the president set up after the George Floyd killing, which was, anti-racism in the academy. And one of the things that we could not do is to get white people to talk about race. White people will not talk about race, okay? And there's a reason for that. Okay. In fact, Dr. Nicol and I got a greeting to this meeting. Esther, did you get your hate mail?
No.
I got mine. Okay. I'm gonna read it to you guys. And welcome to Torrance. Okay. So the flyer was in the envelope. No return address. Okay. And then basically a typed letter that looked like a ransom note. Okay. Dr. Anthony Samad, Executive Director, Donnelly Institute, CSUDH, 1000 East Victoria Street, Carson, California, 90747. Dr. Donna Nicol, Assistant Dean of Liberal Arts College, CSULB, 1250 Bellflower Boulevard, Long Beach, California, 90747. So, does racism and bias and discrimination in the South Bay mean every person of color, in parentheses, is always innocent, never guilty, has no accountability, and always a victim? So the riot in Long Beach recently appeared to only involve people of color. Are they responsible for their behavior, or do they get a pass, an excuse, because they're not white? Okay. Schools and businesses need to be sure to hire people of color, regardless of their qualifications, because they're owed due to the color of their skin. I'm sorry, this is in big, bold letters. I'm sorry, but this is the definition of racism. I'm with Morgan Freeman, who, when asked by 60 Minutes, how do you think we can solve the race problem, replied, stop talking about it. All people need to be held accountable for their actions or lack of them. And by the way, every people in history have been enslaved or did enslave, including people of color. Okay. To reward one group by punishing another is repugnant. And for the record, equity is not equality. Equity means everyone is the same, a clone. Equality means all individuals have equal access, but there are no guarantees for an equal outcome. To try and force equal outcomes is not only impossible, but ridiculously stupid. This is why it is so difficult to talk about race, because people are invested in an ideology. They really don't understand how racial disparities came about, okay? They don't understand that there is a such thing as repairing what has happened in the past. They have simplistic arguments, like, well, why should I pay reparations? I didn't own any slaves. Nobody in my family owned slaves. But there was a benefit that was passed down to you. And just as when you inherit a house, you get the asset, but you also get the liability. And so those who are defenders of the status quo want to have a conversation about how do we go from here, but let's forget about the past. That's not how you correct ills in society. You make a diagnosis as to what the problem was and how it can be fixed. And so as long as you have people who are not prepared to have the whole conversation, and that's a lot, okay, then this is not a problem that can be easily addressed. At this time, I'd like to call up my colleague, Dr. Donna Nicol, and we can go through the report. But, this was just a sample of when you start to introduce the subject of race, you're going to have somebody who is talking crazy and real reckless and basically misinforms other people. I hope this person that wrote this letter is sitting here in the audience. If not, if you know who it is, if you recognize this handwriting, let's have a conversation and maybe you can be informed and enlightened. Dr. Donna Nicol.
Thank you, Dr. Samad. So what I really wanted to highlight today is the report itself and the reason why the report was necessary. So the report was commissioned by the LA County Board of Supervisors in the wake of COVID-19, as well as the protests that came about after the murder of George Floyd, and wanted to really drill down into the data and find out why African Americans in particular were suffering in the way that they were. And so we looked across a number of domains, 5 in particular, but we ended up creating a subdomain. So health, And so we broke that down into physical and mental health. If you look on page 19 in the companion, housing, income, education, and criminal justice. We wanted to provide the county with data-driven, fact-based analysis of why African Americans basically scored low on every single wellness indicator there is. Because if I have the lived experience of being a Black woman who grew up in Compton and lived throughout Los Angeles County, but for some reason when I tell my story, it's not believed because other people don't experience it. And so data had been one of the ways in which people could believe that these things are actually happening. So for example, when it comes to physical health, the average life expectancy for Black residents in LA County is 74.8 years. That's 12 years lower than Asian residents and 6.5 years lower than the county average. For District 4, which is Janice Hahn's district, where Torrance sits and Lomita and the surrounding areas, that average is somewhere between 76 and 80. And so if you go into the different districts, if you go into the report, we have charts for every single domain that looks at how you would fare depending on what part of the county you lived in. Because that also is an indicator, not just being in LA County, but what district you're in. What district you're in also is an indicator of your income level. Oftentimes, income and race are inexplicably tied together. The other thing that was important for us in this report is if we're going to be able to ask the county or demand that the county create policies to rectify these years, multiple years of hardship for African Americans, we needed to be able to back that up and support that with data. The other thing that was important for us, and particularly for Dr. Samad and I'm a historian by training. And so one of the things that Dr. Samad just mentioned is that you can't get to solutions on racism unless you're ready to sit with the history that has come before, because all of these things have a trickle-down effect. And so we wanted to make sure, to even the county's chagrin, that we go back and look at historical trends, not just what happened in the last 5 or 10 years, because that wouldn't give you the full picture. To understand healthcare in Los Angeles County, you would have, an African American's life expectancy, you would have to know that during the 1920s, during the period of Spanish flu, African Americans were prohibited from going to the doctor. And the county created the county health system, so Harvard, UCLA, USC, Martin Luther King Hospital, they created those for the indigent poor because they didn't want to have to see the poor in those hospitals. Like, if we're coming in here, we all are on death's door. Why should I have to go to a separate place in order to get health care? Why did African Americans have to go to a separate blood bank in order to get blood transfusions? So the report, if you go through like the physical health, there's a lot of QPR codes that will give you more information beyond the statistics, beyond the data. Because I think it's important for us to have a really good understanding of what we're dealing with before we start to move to solutions. The other thing that I want to really stress is how important it is to understand that these are long-term projects. The project of undoing racism is not going to happen with the snap of a finger. It's going to take time, and folks get weary real fast. We saw what happened after George Floyd, the protest, and all of a sudden there's this backlash against DEI, for example. When Netflix had a whole section on how to hire Black creators, and all of that has disappeared. within, 3 years, maybe? So if we're really invested in Torrance or anywhere else in undoing the project of racism, and I call racism a project because it's a system. It's more than the individual instances of racism. It's redlining, which was brought up. It's blockbusting. It is, keeping people out of the Cal State system. I have a book coming out in May about the Board of Trustees and the Cal State system, and some of the things that the Cal State system did to not enforce affirmative action mandates. That's the best way to describe it. And it doesn't have to be a sort of thing where people are openly hostile, but the system itself can be hostile. So it doesn't have to be an individual, it can be the system itself. And so what I really want to encourage you to do when you go through the report, if you go on to the digital report itself, what it does is it allows you to manipulate maps so that if you want to look at obesity levels in one part of the county, you can flip over to the other part of the county. We made this interactive because we want people to see, one, LA County is large, but two, they can drill down to their specific areas and see what is happening in those areas. And I think I'm going to pretty much close with this, that if we want to work let me back up. Oftentimes when we talk about this report, and we'll have a receptive audience to listening and learning, and that we're grateful for that. But we often experience, like Dr. Samad, we experience the hate mail that we received. And there's this automatic kind of defense mechanism that is put up where if we talk about something like white privilege does not mean that you didn't have a hard life. It just means that race was not an obstacle to you having a life. And I think that we have to not assume when someone is going to have a conversation about race, it's about you. It's not about you all the time. It's about the system itself that we're participating in. And what can we do as a collective to undo a system of injustice? Thank you.
The first question we have for you is, when it comes to community actions, what do you perceive to be an amplifier of racism here in the South Bay? Whoever would like to begin.
You guys want to take that? Understand it correctly. You said, what are the amplifiers?
Amplifiers of racism. It could be at a global level, or in our case, we'd be curious to know here locally, what do you perceive to be
The history of Torrance. Torrance was a sundown town. California had about 22 sundown towns, in which people who came through this town had to be out of it by sundown, which is why the Torrance Police Department has the history that it has, because of the disproportionate stops, particularly of people of color, So what generally sets the tone of racism is a community culture accepts certain behaviors. And if that means, restricted covenants, if that means that public safety acts in a certain way, then that's what it does.
Anyone else want to take on this question? We'd love to hear from multiple speakers.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to address this. One of the things that I think is really important is to recognize that silence is also an act. And the silence of denial of history, the silence of not admitting your own biases. I recall myself discovering in Vietnam that I didn't have any racial issues. But when I discovered it, I was in an infantry platoon, and I was the only college graduate. And everyone else was, had high school and bad, gangbangers and hillbillies, and when they asked what kind of music I like, I said Mozart, and they said who? And I realized that I was a class bigot. And that's where I think if you're talking about the amplification of issues is when you pretend that you are not subject to bias, that you are free of the impact of racism, even if you are the object of the racism, because many people who are oppressed internalize messages, and then they become part of the shame trolls. And I've been told enough times that I'm not black by black people. And so the issue for me is that racism is amplified when we don't talk about it. And therefore, meetings like this are absolutely essential. And even your report, which is really powerful, I suspect that there are deniers of black reform. Because history represents identity for so many people that to deny that history means to them, they don't have to question who they are and how they are complicit in the creation of discrimination. And we all have, these experiences that we should be allowed to share in spaces. And how do we can, and I think the amplification of racism is when we don't have spaces where these reports can be given, when these conversations can be had, and when we can ask questions about ourselves. What part do we play? What have we done? Have we looked the other way? Have we stood up for those who are not ourselves? Because if you think that what happens to an Asian woman when walking through the park and gets attacked, that's my issue too. And I think we all should feel the universal nature of justice. And when your injustice becomes my injustice, that's when we begin to make a breakthrough about racism. Because I just find it very upsetting when people get into my oppression is better than your oppression, or I've suffered more. Historically, there are these differences, and I'm not disputing that. But how do we move beyond competition about prejudice and find some common ground? And that's what we have to do, I think, to minimize these institutional issues.
Please.
There's this concept called absence of presence. This kind of duality of two things that are happening at the same time. And oftentimes, when it comes to issues of race, there's this kind of absence of race while it's present at the same time. Let me give you an example, a very simple one to illustrate this point. When you're watching local news, when they're describing suspects, they racialize certain groups, and then there's an absence of race for other groups. So if the suspect is a white male, you'll get his height, you'll get his weight, you'll get down to where he had a scar on his top lip. But when you're talking about someone who's black or brown, automatically you will get their racial categorization along with all the other details. So race is present even if you don't speak it. And the problem with the absence and presence is it allows for people to try to sidestep the existence of racism by saying, well, it didn't come up in the conversation, so it obviously couldn't happen. When I taught at Cal State Fullerton, I was teaching in women's studies, and I had a student who said, well, I've never experienced racism. I said, okay, that's fine. And I've never been racist to anyone else. I said, well, also fine. But I just don't think I think people are exaggerating the point. And I said, where do you live? And the student said, Laguna Niguel. And so I said, how often do you interact with people of color who are not in service roles in your neighborhood, that aren't gardeners or people cooking your food? How often do you actually leave Orange County to interact with people who are different than you? And the student just got super quiet. And I contend that the failure of the federal government to enforce the Fair Housing Act is one of the big problems that we have, because we don't live side by side, so we don't get to interact with each other. We go into these ethnic enclaves where we never have to deal with the issue of difference, because everyone, to your point about affinity bias, we stay within our own little tribe, our own little area. And so then when you get confronted, you're like, well, it doesn't exist here, because you're doing this absence and presence thing. If you don't see it present, you think it doesn't exist. And so I think one of the biggest challenges for those of us who are really focused on getting rid of racial bias and injustice is that we're going to have to come out, we're going to have to model for other people how to come out of our little enclaves and interact with people differently. The other, getting to a larger systemic issue, we also need to, as concerned citizens, look at how our policies have been created and how our policies are being enforced. Because oftentimes, I will have folks say, well, the policies are neutral. The language of the policy might be neutral, but the application of the policy is something different. And then the impact of that is completely different even still. So when people are making requests of police departments to have citizen oversight, it's not so that you can just badger the police, it's to see how have you enforced a policy that should have been equally applied across the board. If you show disproportionately the number of stops of Black people in Torrance, for example, it's not the policy, not the policy itself, it's the application of the policy, and that's a little bit more nebulous for us to be able to drill down on, and so people can deny it. But when you start to record it, you know, you have body cam and all of these other sort of things, and you start to record it, then you have that hard data, then it's irrefutable. So I think there's a number of ways in which it's amplified through silence of absence and presence, but also, I'm gonna get on the soapbox, so let me get on. But also that we don't take the time as a collective to look at how these policies are doing harm because of the way we apply them.
Just briefly, so there's this concept called the spiral of silence, or theory actually, and it basically says that, let's say this room full of people, the loudest person in the room states their opinion, and because they're the loudest, people oftentimes think that they're the majority perspective, which is false, because sometimes that one person might state something that might be really harmful or not correct at all or factual, and that silences everyone else around them. So it's very important. We're living in a society, a democracy, where people actually need to have open dialogue and have these different perspectives and say it out loud, because that silent majority, if they remain silent, people in authority take that and they revel up a spur of bad decisions and poor behavior within a group, and it's not beneficial for the masses. So I think very open dialogue, and if you see something or hear something that might be incorrect, I think it's good to have healthy dialogue. That's it.
Well, thank you very much, all four of you, for addressing our first prepared question. The second one we have is that when it comes to the research that you've done about racism, especially in this community, are there any changes you've made in your approach, or are there any changes you foresee yourself making in your approach to address racism in this step towards progress?
The politics of the report is to address inequity. When you get into this conversation of comparative suffering, you know, my suffering is worse than yours, or we need it worse than you need it, kind of thing. Everybody loses, okay? America has woven racism into its fabric, okay? You could have 10 people today leave this meeting and say, I'm going to become an anti-racist, okay? And then you have another 10 people who become just as entrenched. You know, we were joking about it, you know, that Esther didn't get her letter, or you didn't get your letter, you know, but that was intentional on the part of somebody. And we say in the study, anti-blackness is a thing. You know, there are people that do target black people, including not just law enforcement, including insurance companies, banks, and everybody else. You know, and so there has to be a process to begin to address racial inequity, and the quickest or most rational way to do it is generally class-based inequity. Class-based inequity, there's just as many poor whites in America as there are poor Latinos, poor Asians, and poor blacks. But when you begin to graph where they are, you very easily see the intersection between class and race, okay? And then that's the conversation, that's the starting point of the conversation. America for 60 years has been trying to legislate social change. That's not gonna work, you know. The most violent person, non-violent person in the history of the 20th century, you know, Martin Luther King, they killed him, okay? And his whole philosophy was nonviolence. But when he began to focus on economic disparities, he was organizing a poor people's campaign at the time, he was murdered, you know. Then you began, and then they took a poll. And while, excuse me, we look at how they have tried to change public perception as to who King was. Okay, he was the most hated person in America. He was disliked. Most of the people in most of the polls taken April 4th, 1968 said Martin Luther King was unpopular. Okay, and basically since the holiday, there has been this coaptation of King as a dreamer, which if you go see the monument in Washington, I have a dream is nowhere around. There's over 24 King sayings, and I have a dream is not one of them. So that's a coaptation of what they hoped, you know, would massage what was essentially white guilt over the murder of King. You know, so the conversation of racism and what we could do individually is basically met with the bombardment of images and negative messages. You know, for every anti-racist you create, you run into somebody who thinks that because African Americans are getting a benefit in making up racial inequity, they become anti-black, you know, and that's how I see it.
Yes, so the question is, after your research about issues of racism in this community and elsewhere, are there any changes you've made to your approach, or are there any changes you foresee yourself making in the future?
Well, the report is really a two-phase report. So phase one, we concentrated mostly on physical and mental health as well as criminal justice. The other domains, so income, housing, and education, will be part of the second phase of the report. So in that regard, we will have a much more complete report. The reason why we did it in phases was essentially because we were going through COVID at the time this report was commissioned. And so just being able to meet and to do the things that were necessary to put the report together was a challenge, right? I don't know what the county plans to do with regards to the second iteration of the report. I'm not on the second iteration of the report. But I'm hopeful that they will continue to amplify that these are long civil rights struggles. That this isn't something that like this little snapshot that just happened. That you have to contextualize what's happening. You know, of course, my interest as a historian is to make sure we have a full, complete picture, as opposed to, I also have degrees in education, and education tends to look at stuff in the last 10 years and then kind of leave the history alone. The problem with that is that you keep doing the same thing over and over again because you haven't figured out, you did that 30 years ago, but if you only look in the last 10 years, you can't really get a full grasp on the problem. So my hope is that they will continue to contextualize why you have education issues, the educational disparities. If you look in the Cal State system, for example, or just across the state, we have a low high school graduation rate for the state of California. For a state this size, only half of the graduates from high school across all races are eligible for the UC or the CSU. That's a problem that is years in the making. And so if only, let's say, 800,000 students graduate from high school, only 400,000 of them are eligible to go to a CSU or a UC. We're doing something really wrong in not helping these students at least have a range of options, right? And so what I'm hoping that the report will do is to give us an answer as to why we have such low high school graduation rates or low A through G completion rates to go to college or university if someone so chooses. I don't think that if I were to continue with the report, I don't think that the approach would change. I think more so getting out into communities like this community here, coming to these kind of meetings, we would do more of that because the report, it can sit on a shelf if we don't act on it. And the more the community knows about it, the better chance it is for us to come up with a solution. I'll say this. Dr. Samad and I were very, very committed to going almost on like a speaking tour of the report. But the county had other priorities. And so Dr. Samad and I are doing this because we want the community to know that this report exists. There's resources out there. There are people who are interested in these issues. And so instead of getting caught up in the county bureaucracy, we're doing our kind of lone ranger and rangeress shtick because we think it's important. Like when you go to vote, you're not just voting for a candidate because they're charismatic. You're voting for somebody because they're going to put down policies. They're going to make sure the lights are on in your neighborhood, all of those things, but you also need to know where they stand on coalition building between different groups of people. That's the question we don't ask our politicians, but we should. Do you get along with people? I mean, if you saw the LA County Board of Supervisors, was it the supervisors or the city council? City council. Where they had the three city council, where they made these disparaging comments about African Americans and darker skinned Latinos. Voters are the biggest resource we have in terms of making change. So the more informed a voter is, the better we are.
Excellent. Mr. Morrison, Esther, do you also have reflections?
As a historian, I believe in the power of words and the power of knowledge, but I also am very aware of the power of denial. And, the good cause, the Civil War, the history of the Civil War is still being waged in certain parts of the country where the South are victims. That the war was not about slavery, even though every state in its legislature said explicitly that they were seceding from the Union because slavery was not being allowed to spread. No doubt about it. And yet people have been working on a story that is not about race and slavery and putting it in the textbooks and retelling the story. So the question for me is, how do we get people to re-examine their own story and their resistance to the story of others, and to make their story, to make my story their story, so that we are collaborating in creating a story that impacts all of us. And one of the ways is to, come out of our silo and engage as an ambassador of your silo to another silo, which is why we're here, why she is here, because we have an investment that we can break the cycle of isolation through information, through history. And if, for example, you're in this room resisting the import of this information, I'd be curious as to you to tell me why. There's a story behind your resistance. And maybe in that story, we can find common ground. So, for example, I was invited to be on a board that had to do with the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And I thought, should I do that? I'm not Japanese. And I said yes. And my life has changed. I know more about Japanese culture, I know more about World War II and what happened. And because of that, I feel that this World War II project, which by the way, is a project that's going to take place here in Torrance, the names of all those people are going to be in Columbia Park, just south of the middle school where I was principal when I first came to Torrance as a principal. So it's that step that all of us can take. Can you do something that may be uncomfortable, that may be unfamiliar, but really gets to bridging the gap between ourselves and other people? Because affinity, bias is natural. We all want to be with our group, only if nothing else, because we can talk about how it is to be in that group, and how people treat us. And yet, when I get together with other black people, there's, oh boy, we're creating trouble. No, we're just talking, we're telling our story. But there must be a space where my story can be told to your story, and her story as well, so that we create our story. And so we have to be willing to step into the discomfort of doing something that we don't tend to want to do. And that's the hard part. That's the hard part. And when I talk about what can we do more of, including myself, is doing more of that. And that's why I so appreciate your being here today. Because people need to know this history. And it just shows the power of history and the power of knowledge. There's a reason why they're banning books. Because if you read the history and you really embrace it, then you're going to have a completely different sense of identity about your own nation and the benefit that has come to you without even you being aware of it. And some people don't want to know that they have benefited from systems of injustice. They just don't. And we have to ask, well, why don't you want to know that? And there's a story there. So keep on asking questions and listening to the answers. And to ask yourself, why am I bothered by the research? What does it say about me as a citizen? What do I do once I know this knowledge? For example, reparations. Do you know that the federal government was willing to pay and did pay enslavers at the end of the war because they thought they were losing their property, and so so the federal government paid enslavers for the amount of money they thought they lost because of emancipation. I didn't know that until a few years ago. And yet, it completely changes the idea that we make decisions all the time about what we're willing to pay for. Did you know that Woodrow Wilson literally eliminated black people from the federal government in 1916? Completely. The federal government was integrated until a president decided no more black people in the federal government. This has been going on for decades.
Centuries.
For centuries. Thank you. For centuries. And talking about it, are you aware of the brutality of the mistreatment of Asian Americans in California ever since the gold rush? It has been, and people say this is not systemic. Why? Because when you look at pictures of the completion of the railroad, there are no Asians in them. They built the railroad, but when the picture was taken, they said, get out of the picture. And so now children don't even realize that that's happened. So, I'm on a soapbox. I'm sorry. There's so much to say.
There's no short. Esther, would you also like to opine?
Yes.
I'm going to just keep it short, but I think making sure that there is no erasure in our history books is very vital and important. So, school teachers ask questions.
Wonderful. And so we can now get to our audience question portion of the event. So this time around, I'll ask one question for each of these ones that we've been provided. And one person would like to take each of the questions we have so we can hear what our audience had to ask. This first one we have reminds me of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela in South Africa in addressing issues like the power of denial and massaging guilt, as we heard from Dr. Samad and Mr. Morrison. The question is, could we start a truth-telling and reconciliation process with an acknowledgement of harm, listening sessions, narrative collection, and practice, change, and repair? If so, where do we start and how? I suppose this is trying to address the issue that happens in reverse racism as well, that we see in South Africa. Julius Malema has gained a lot of support, and that's one fear I know we've heard about since when Mr. Morrison was talking about the Civil War era, the fear that was being spread with the Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney in the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, which was really scaring a lot of white people in the U.S. about what happened in Haiti when Jean-Jacques Dessalines carried out a massacre of the remaining French people. So I believe this question is about truth and reconciliation, and how do we start and where do we go with it when it comes to racism?
1 minute. Each or no? 1 minute total. Okay.
Mr. Morrison, how about you, since you already had some?
I was going to give Esther a chance to talk.
Oh, that's so.
She wants to address it. If not, we can handle it. Yeah.
Whoever would like that.
I'm trying to give you some love, girl.
I go with an educator on this
Okay.
question.
All right, we'll take that one.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
So, one of the things that we often do is we replicate bad behavior. Historically, Europe has oftentimes sought to colonize and divvy up the world. One of the things that South Africa tried to do with the Race and Reconciliation Commission is to address the atrocities of the apartheid period, which they replicated exactly America's segregation system, okay? Creating a social pecking order based on race, colors, and Afrikaans who were whites. They made them carry passes. We took our students, our Donnelly Fellows, to South Africa last year, 2023. And we did Johannesburg and we did Cape Town. And so they have turned all of the prisons and all of the, well, many of them, I'll say, but the most brutal one, which is Robben Island, is now a museum run by former inmates of the prison. But what they try to do is talk through the history of abuse that apartheid created. America never did that. And there are over 200 vestiges of slavery that is still in our society. And then there's a whole other 36 vestiges of segregation. And when you go south, you see it. And so that was part of our introduction, is that, you have to have a horrible history when you don't want to talk about it. Okay? Okay, I'll stop. The other side of
Not that I don't want you to talk about it.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful response on truth and reconciliation. If anyone else would like to speak on this, please, we'd be happy to hear it, but we also have some other questions, but we have some enthusiasm for this topic.
No, we really only have a
Okay.
few more minutes.
Well,
I want to be mindful of our time.
crunch. So the next question we have, it is also another topic that's being discussed a lot, which is critical race theory. Do you have a suggestion on how to respond as an educator to parents and community members accusing teachers of brainwashing their K through 12 students with critical race theory?
Okay, first of all, critical race theory has not been taught in K through 12. When Kimberly Crenshaw created the theory, it was for law students. It is to look at how policies and customs in our society create these kind of racial oppressions that weren't necessarily intended. Let me give you an example. There's a Meritor Bank versus Vincent versus Meritor Bank case. That was the landmark case that established the definition of sexual harassment in this country. It was brought by a black woman who had experienced years, almost 8 years, of heinous sexual harassment on the job. When she went to her equal opportunity office or affirmative action office, they said, you can file a complaint for race, but we don't have anything for gender, because gender was not a protected class at that point. And so she said, but I'm getting this, he's not targeting black men, he's targeting me as a black woman. I'm a both and, right? The court came back and said, we'll have a judgment on gender, but you gotta pick an injury, whether it's race or gender. You can't pick both. If you look at the 14th Amendment, it said the state shall not discriminate on the basis of race, creed, national origin, but it doesn't say and any combination thereof. And so what I'm saying with all of this is that critical race theory looks at that kind of oppression that is created from a policy that is supposed to be neutral. Like when veterans came back, black veterans came back from World War II, and they did not have the same access to the GI Bill. They got less money to purchase a home. critical race theory is asking you to think beyond the surface level of a policy to look at the consequences and the impact. That requires you to have basic critical thinking skills that K-12 kids don't have just yet. I would argue some of the ones that come on to college don't get it either. But that's another issue. 20 years of teaching, Lord. All right, but it was reserved. Critical race theory is not, we're going to make white people feel bad. All the years that I've taught critical race theory, I never said white people were bad. I said systems were problematic and that the policies had these consequences that no one accounts for. That is why critical race theory, everybody hears, the critical part and freaks out. But what they're saying is critical, meaning critical thinking. Think deeper than the surface level. So anyone who's saying I should be fearful of critical race theory, I can almost guarantee when I talk to them, I ask them, well, what is critical race theory? And they don't know. They couldn't give me an example or anything. And so it's just like this new boogeyman or boogie woman that people throw out there as a way to cut off any kind of conversation with regards to race, this history, all of those sort of things.
Excellent. The next question we have from the audience, it's something probably lighter than our previous two. If you can say something to your high school self or a class of high schoolers about your experience, what would you want to say or emphasize? Esther, would you be interested in this one?
Sure. So something I would say to my past self is just be proud of who you are, exactly who you are. Yeah, it was very difficult for me to be proud of my heritage until later on in life. But I was also embarrassed, like sometimes, like my grandma, she did not speak a lick of English and she was very proud of it. She was very stubborn. But for me, she taught me everything that I need to know in the Korean household. And I'm very, very proud of my heritage now.
I'd like to speak to this. I think we all want to belong. We all want to be seen and accepted for who we are. And I think that's what, if there was a message I could give to a high school student now, to my high school self, embrace your difference, celebrate it, own it, because there's only one you. And that is what everyone is entitled to believe about themselves. Unfortunately, our society is structured where some people are led to believe they are better. And that's what the systemic racism is about. Whereas if we could get people to understand that we all are entitled to be respected and accepted and included and be treated fairly, then we'd be in a better place, especially high school students who are desperate to want to belong. But we have to convince them that they are, as however different they are, that's who they are. And to just own it. And and that's where diversity will thrive, when everyone owns who they are rather than trying to be what they're not.
I think this notion of pride is very important that Esther raises for us, and it ties together nicely with what Mr. Morrison says about belonging. That being the case, oftentimes pride is used by groups who are victims of racism to try to be able to give themselves much dignity. For that reason, a question we have is, why do you think it is the case that separatism has been able to gain favor among groups who are subject to racism? Malcolm X had the notion of separatism in the US. Many Kurds in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey have that idea. And Jewish people who were Zionists and established Israel, they also have this notion of separatism. Do you think it also creates its own set of problems?
Well, with regards to Malcolm X, Malcolm X and this idea of separatism is because of the system that he would be functioning in was going to make sure he knew he was separate. So I want to be clear about how he initially began his activism was within this framework of segregation. But we have to also allow for space for people to grow and to change. And we keep telling the same narrative about Malcolm X without the other part of the narrative, which is that he started to embrace different races and different groups when he came back from Mecca. So I want to clarify that. Same thing holds with the Panthers. Everybody sees the guns and the berets, and they never look at the breakfast program, the ambulance service, the blood banks, and so forth. So we need to give everyone, and I also say this as a black woman, to give space for white people the space to grow and to learn. But what happens oftentimes is that people become so foreclosed to their own ideas that they separate. In this case, they separate because they think it's comfortable. And sometimes, a more immature person won't give someone the opportunity to grow or to give them the grace. I had to facilitate discussion with students, and they would say, well, you white people all this, and you black people all this, and it's like, stop, hold up, calm down. Let's lay some ground rules for how we're going to talk to each other, number one. Number two, you have to give people an opportunity to grow. Because if you don't, they are going to retaliate or they're going to retreat into their enclave, and they're not going to get any better. If we talk about sexism, you can't, and I taught in women's studies for 10 years, you can't, bash men over the head and expect men to also be open to women. There are injustice. I'm not saying that there is no sexism, but I also say that there is a way in which we talk about these issues that will open people up, make them think about stuff a little bit more. I might not solve all of our problems in one conversation. I'm not expecting to. But, if you make a mistake, own the mistake and be open to growing. And I think that's how we can deal with the separation amongst groups, is that we got to give folks some grace. Now, when folks act a fool, you need to be called on it and expect to be called.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have for the question and answer portion of the event. Now we have our president, Gloria, to give some wrap-ups and final thoughts on the event. Thank you very much.
No, my speech is gone, but that's okay, I can wing it. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I do hope that in addition to joining us in person for this event, that you'll also consider membership. We are a co-ed organization. We've been around 104 years. Our own chapter here in Torrance has been 60 years plus, which I found out recently is longer than the city of Lomita has been around. Pretty cool. So can we give a shout out to our Thank you so much. It was wonderful being able to hear everybody's perspectives and to talk about some solutions, because I think it sounds like it's all about conversations, right? So we'll have to figure out how do we get those started. Maybe that's going to happen in a new panel in the future. Also, for upcoming events, we have an environmental event on Earth Day. So whether or not you join our membership, I would like to see you at our El Camino event on Earth Day. It's a teach-in about climate solutions to use in the South Bay. Am I forgetting anything, members? Does that sound about right? All right. Oh, Deborah, yes.
Please fill out the complete survey, or in paper. We have them right outside on the table, or if you've got a smartphone, we've got the sign posted closing the survey. Take your picture and fill it out online. I'm sure Lori would love it online. But if you fill it out in paper or grab one and just look at the League of Women Voters Torrance area website where you send it, you can send it, take a picture teacher and send it to us in an email. I mean, you fill it out in paper.
Yes, it does give you the opportunity to write if you have any other topics in mind that you think we should be considering. So in addition to letting us know how you liked tonight's event, you can also tell us what you think we should be working on. Thank you, everyone.